Hello, and welcome to the first edition of the Binge Chickens book reviews. I'm one half of the Binge Chickens, Alex, and I'm here today to talk about, from a certain point of view, The Empire Strikes Back, which was the new book put out by Star Wars Publishing this year to celebrate last year to celebrate 40 years of The Empire Strikes Back. Obviously, it's a book with 40 different short stories from 40 different authors, some previously involved with Star Wars literature, some not previously involved with Star Wars literature. We saw 3 years ago with the From a Certain Point of View, A New Hope edition. It's actually a really good testing ground for potential new authors into the franchise, which is a really great way to introduce people and potentially unearth some really good, interesting writers who have different sort of perspectives on a galaxy far, far away. So what I might do is I'll go through the stories and review probably sort of my highlights and give my thoughts at a high level. I don't want to give any spoilers for people that haven't read this book, because I do really encourage people to get out and give it a go, because it's a really enjoyable read. I think when you've got 40 different authors, you're always going to find something in there that you will like, no matter what your perspective is or your enjoyment in Star Wars. There's always going to be something in there for people to enjoy. So what I might do is I'll run through some of the stories that I really enjoyed first, and then I might talk about some of the stories that perhaps I didn't enjoy as much for a few different particular reasons, and sort of go from there. But looking at it from the point of view of the stories that I did enjoy, working my way through from, obviously, so the stories are set out in chronological order based on the movie. So if a particular story starts at a point sort of identifiable in the movie, they've sort of placed them in that order, although there are some rarer occasions where actually the ending of the story is where they decide to place the story in the book. For example, the story involving the Millennium Falcon with Lando, and if people have seen Solo, there's a particular reason why Lando would have a connection with the Falcon. That story begins in the asteroid field, but actually ends on their escape from Bespin, which is actually where the story ends up being placed. But obviously, so that means that the first, perhaps third of this book is based around stories set on Hoth. And the first story that I really enjoyed, to make it clear, I enjoyed all of the stories in this book, but if I'm sort of elevating some stories particularly above others, the first story that I really enjoyed was Iron Control, which before this book was released, there was a lot of speculation around whether the authors in this book would try to give deeper, more interesting roles or backgrounds to a lot of the female characters that we saw either on screen or in the background. And in particular, the character in Iron Control, who actually has a speaking line in the movie, or a few speaking lines in the movie, but I think had been identified by name in the old expanded universe, but hadn't really been brought back into the current canon. So Torrin Farr is the name of the woman who operates Iron Control in the movie, and this is a really great little story. They sort of start with her sort of talking about that all the officers have a betting pool on whether Han and Leia will get together, or whether Han will express his feelings for Leia, which I thought is quite a nice little quirky take on that relationship, and that sort of peering from the outside in at, will they, won't they, in the offices, and, as a distraction from what's going on Hoth. So that story is by Emily Skrutsky, I believe is how that's pronounced, and so I really enjoyed that sort of take on it. It also brings in her little sister, I believe, who was serving as a pilot in Rogue Squadron, which was also a character that had existed in the old expanded universe. I think they were in a story in the Bounty Hunters collection of short stories in the old canon, which I suppose makes sense that was sort of set around Empire Strikes Back and after Empire Strikes Back. So I think that was Samok was her younger sister. So bringing both of them back into the canon was a nice little way to do that. Sort of moving through some of the other stories, but the Truest Duty was a particular highlight. There's a person who posts a lot on Twitter called Veers Watch, and this story was from the perspective of General Veers, and actually reveals at the end a little nice twist to that story that would make Veers Watch quite happy, I suspect. essentially, Veers, as most people would know, was the commander of the ground forces on Hoth for the Empire, and took down the shield generator. There's a deleted scene in Empire Strikes Back where Hobby flies his snowspeeder into Veers' AT-AT, which was sort of debatably potentially canon, potentially not canon. So this story sort of goes into all of that, which was quite fun. A Naturalist on Hoth was another story that I quite enjoyed. I think that sort of more quirky style has a place in Star Wars. I think there's always a struggle to balance the humor in Star Wars so that it's not tipping too far towards the Marvel end of the scale and actually stays true to Star Wars. And I think that this story did that really well. It's about a character who's quite old, I think. I was actually surprised as the story progressed that this character had sort of lived through, I'm not sure if they lived through the Clone Wars or if they'd been around since then anyway, but they clearly predated the Empire, but were serving on Hoth as part of the Rebel Alliance, and I think in the end actually stays on Hoth after the evacuation. So I found that a little fun story as well, set on Hoth. A lot of this, and I'll sort of talk about things that I didn't like or didn't think worked as well a bit later, but I guess as a general point, I do find it interesting with these books and I'll talk a little bit later about stories that do it really well. There are some stories that clearly connect or work off each other really well. So clearly the authors, to an extent, perhaps voluntarily, are in communication with each other as they're writing these stories. But in other cases, it feels like either the authors or the editors aren't doing a strong enough job from my perspective of kind of getting these stories to be cohesive, because to just talk about it quickly, I think there was maybe 2 or 3 stories in the Hoth section of the book that really focused or really leaned heavily into Jyn Erso's line about rebellions are built on hope. And the first time you read that in a story, you kind of think, okay, yes, Star Wars stories have always riffed off the movies. They've always referenced the movies. They've always had quotes from the movies in them. But when you get to maybe the 3rd or 4th story that's still using that same line, it does start to feel a bit repetitious, and it's a little bit surprising that the editors didn't catch that and perhaps use a different line, because there's plenty of other lines in the Star Wars universe that could be riffed on for essentially the same purpose without using this exact same line over and over. But moving on from Hoth, I think those were sort of the stories that I really liked from Hoth. But straight away after the rebels escape from Hoth, we get a fantastic story called Rendezvous Point by Jason Fryer, which sort of promised to be a love letter to Michael Stackpole and Aaron Alston, and I didn't quite know what to expect, how direct the references would be. I thought perhaps, okay, so maybe we'll get, Wes Jansen doing something or some sort of funny humor to sort of pay homage to Aaron Alston. But what we got was essentially a short story version of one of the Rogue Squadron novels. We got, without sort of giving away the whole plot, we got from, Wedge reforming a squadron, picking the pilots, training the pilots who are sort of, rough around the edges. We got Wes Jansen saying hub grub to say, the food that they get in the hub on the ship is hub grub. A clear echo of the yub nub sort of line that he made famous in the Aaron Alston books. So very direct references to those old X-Wing books, which was absolutely fantastic. And this was arguably my favorite story in the whole set. So well worth the wait, well worth the anticipation and the tease and the sort of linking of it to the X-Wing books of old, and a really worthwhile and great addition to the canon. And then in a really similar way, the Final Order, which is from the perspective of an Imperial captain, Cannon House, I think is his name, who is serving on the Ultimatum, which is essentially set up as Ray Sloane's Imperial Star Destroyer, and she's off on another mission in this story. This is a story that in a lot of ways invokes Matthew Stover's influences on the old Star Wars canon. And what I mean by that is we get a lot of references in this story to Harun Kal, which many people might know is Mace Windu's homeworld. I think in the old canon and potentially also in the new new Disney canon as well. I'm not sure if we've explicitly been told that or if we've explicitly seen Harun Kal before, but this actually has scenes set on Harun Kal where we can see that it's still very much in the image that Matthew Stover had set up for it in the old canon, which is great to see. But the references don't end there, and towards the end of the story, Cannon House is sort of standing there as his ship goes into the asteroid field because. Spoiler, maybe not spoiler. So this story is set on the Star Destroyer that in Empire Strikes Back we see when Vader is having his conference with the Imperial captains. One of the Star Destroyers is struck by an asteroid, and this is this Star Destroyer. We get Cannon House towards the end of the story talking about, as a child, loving to watch these old, I guess, equivalent of, Saturday morning cartoons, one of which was called Laser Masters, where the character in the TV show says, you shall not pass, or something to that extent, which is and talking about, okay, this character is standing in the Senate halls fighting off hordes of alien beasts, and it's a clear and direct reference to Matthew Stover's Traitor, which was obviously Legends canon now, set during the Yuuzhan Vong War, where Gamma Rhysode makes his final stand to protect Jason in the Senate chambers on Coruscant as the Yuuzhan Vong invade. So two really clear Matthew Stover influences in this story, which was really great to see and really enjoyable from Dickinson, I believe it was, who wrote that story. And then talking earlier about the fact that some of the authors or some of the stories don't really flow together, this is a really great example of stories that do flow together, because we get the final order from Dickinson, and then we get Lord Vader Will See You Now from John Jackson Miller, and this story is from the perspective of Ray Sloane and explains where she was, why she wasn't on the ultimatum, and then also has direct references to Cannon House, who had not been named before these short story collection. So clearly Miller and Dickinson were in communication. They potentially sort of planned these stories as a sort of like a 1-2 punch, and they work really well off each other, with Sloane learning that the ultimatum's been destroyed, sort of justifying to Vader why she was so slow in coming back. She sort of presents evidence for why that's the case, and she survives the confrontation with Vader. But this was one of the few really great examples in this set of stories where it shows that even though these are self-contained short stories, they don't have to be sort of running counter to each other, or I guess sort of little bubbles of canon where you can potentially end up, and there are a few stories where it felt like they were almost rubbing up against each other in terms of if this story collection is supposed to be considered canon, where these stories have slight differences to each other when they cover the same events, how that reconciles in canon. I mean, a good example of that, which it wasn't explicitly an issue, was the two Boba Fett stories, Tooth and Claw, and also Standard Imperial Procedure. And I really enjoyed Standard Imperial Procedure, perhaps a bit more than Tooth and Claw. I thought Tooth and Claw, which was a story more focused on Bosk, sorry, not Tooth and Claw, I should say. It was Wait For It. It was Wait For It and Standard Imperial Procedure are the two Boba Fett stories. And Wait For It, I believe, ends with Fett coming back to find the Falcon, as we see in episode 5, whereas Standard Imperial Procedure has him docked on one of the Star Destroyers for repairs. And an argument can be made that it sort of follows directly on from the last story, but there is a little bit of discontinuity between those two stories, which sort of bothered me a little bit at the start, but then Standard Imperial Procedure was actually a really great story, so it sort of was able to go with the flow on that one. Standard Imperial Procedure is another great one that I really enjoyed, where the character in question has been demoted because he's not followed Imperial Procedure, and he's now working in the garbage disposal section of the Star Destroyer. And of course, as we know from Empire Strikes Back, Han is able to hide in the garbage that's disposed of before the fleet jumps to hyperspace. So sort of riffs on that as being part of Imperial Procedure. I guess just jumping back a little bit, Aruna Kell's Rules for Survival, I think is the name of the story. Aruna Kell's Rules for TIE Pilot Survival, probably, by Django Wexler. Another really enjoyable story. And I guess there's a few stories, not just in this from a certain point of view, but from the A New Hope one as well, where you are clearly getting perspectives from characters where it's meant to evoke sympathy, where when you rewatch the film, it's characters who potentially die in the film, where, faceless stormtroopers or faceless TIE fighter pilots or faceless X-Wing pilots or faceless whoever. This is meant to evoke sympathy for those characters that we previously wouldn't have had, so we can rewatch the film in a new and interesting way. So reading this story, to begin with, I felt like it was a case of building up this sympathy for these TIE pilots who I presumed were going to be the TIE pilots that follow Han and Leia into the asteroid field and are destroyed while Han and Leia find refuge on the asteroid. So I'm sort of reading this story thinking, this is a really cool character, really interesting storyline. It's sort of her with her, she's a bit rough around the edges, but she's, found ways to survive as a TIE fighter pilot. She's got her partner or her wingmate who she's sort of starting to develop feelings for, even though she knows she shouldn't. And I'm reading it, I'm just thinking it's going to be such a shame that, it's such a frustrating end to have them get killed off. But that's not necessarily the case. I don't want to spoil the story, but that's not necessarily the case in this story. So it's actually another really engaging and interesting story. And I love those sorts of stories that flesh out characters and give them really clear identities. And I don't want to go too much off on a tangent, but I feel like this is the sort of story about Imperial pilots, Rebel pilots, like Rendezvous Point, like Rogue 2, like Against the Odds, I think it is, which is the Dash Render, the DAC, not Dash Render, the DAC story, which I think give much more clear identities and individual identities to some of these pilots than we've necessarily seen in the new canon so far. Moving on then, and so we get past the asteroid belt, we get to a few stories set on Dagobah. We have a really great story set from the perspective of the cave, which is confronting Yoda, which I believe is called Vergence, and Yoda's sort of confronted with apparitions of Qui-Gon Jinn, clone troopers, Ahsoka, to sort of remind Yoda about his previous failures. We get Count Dooku, which was a really cool little story. I like it when it's sort of from that more interesting perspective, although I'll talk a little bit later about some of the other stories that we got from a few of the animals' perspectives, which perhaps were okay, but got a little bit repetitive. But we got There Is Always Another, which I really enjoyed as a story set from the perspective of Obi-Wan as a Force ghost trying to confront Luke and get him to stay with Yoda on Dagobah. And what I really liked about this story, and I guess it's sort of showing my colours as somebody that really enjoyed the old expanded universe, whenever I see examples of the old expanded universe being brought back into canon, I get a little bit excited. And in There Is Always Another, which is written by Mackenzie Lee, clearly Mackenzie was a fan of the old... potentially, I'm assuming here, a fan of the old Jedi Apprentice and Jedi Quest little junior novels by, is it Jude Watson, I believe was her name? I could be corrected on that. But we get characters such as Siri Tachi and True Veld get references or name drops in this story, as sort of... Siri was sort of Obi-Wan's crush or romantic interest as he was an apprentice under Qui-Gon, and then True Veld was one of Anakin's close friends as he was developing as a Padawan as well. So love to see these sorts of old name drops into canon, because there's really no reason why these names can't, or these names or these characters or these places can't be brought back into canon. There's no argument to be made for why we could have, instead of Siri Tachi, we just have another female Padawan that Obi-Wan was interested in. Why not just bring forward those characters? It doesn't detract from the story, it just enriches it for people that grew up on those original stories. So I really enjoyed seeing that in that story. And then, speaking of, we got a fantastic story from Fake It Till You Make It, which was from the perspective of Jackson, who was from the comics by Cavan Scott. And I never really read many of the old Star Wars comics, but I was aware that Jackson was sort of a sort of less than strict canon, I might say, character from those old comics, because I think he's basically a giant bunny rabbit, and that's sort of riffed on in this story as well. And Cavan Scott, who's writing a few of the High Republic books, is an author I hadn't really come across yet, because I think he's mainly been involved with the comic side of Star Wars. But this story was really, really good, and I am really sort of optimistic for what he's going to bring to the High Republic based on this story. And we get little drops from old canon as well with Jackson himself, but then also, he references to Cernpadal, which, talking about the Yuuzhan Vong before, Cernpadal was, I think, the planet where Lando had a mining operation at the start of the Yuuzhan Vong War. So it's really enriching to see. It's as simple as talking about a transport operation that could go from one planet to another, and he just happens to use Cernpadal, and it's as simple as that, and it's an offhand reference. But just like with the Final Order, just like with other stories, you just need just those offhand references, just enrich it a little bit for people that did grow up on those stories, and it doesn't detract from these stories at all. And I really enjoyed the pacing of this story and the resolution for this story, and how there's sort of a few twists and turns in it, which really give me confidence for Scott's High Republic works, and makes me anticipate them much more than I might have, considering I don't have a whole lot of knowledge of his works other than the fact that he has worked on a few of the Star Wars comics. So really enjoyable story, and really looking forward to what he's going to bring to the table. Another really enjoyable story was But What Does He Eat? Which, as a child, I've always enjoyed that scene where Han bursts into the dining room, Vader's sitting at the end of the table, and he basically says, we will be honored if you would join us. And the scene sort of ends with Vader sitting back down at the table, and you'd sort of think that, okay, they've ambushed Han, they've ambushed Leia, they're going to arrest them, they're going to take them off for torture. But they sit back down at the table, and I've always thought, okay, the door closes, and do they sit down? Do they actually have a meal? And this story, it's clear that, they're sort of having the same thought. They've perhaps had the same thoughts as I have. I think it's S.A. Chakraborty wrote this story. And it's essentially from the perspective of Lando's head chef. And she's sort of dragged in the middle of the day to prepare this meal for Vader. And there's a really interesting undercurrent to the story as well, which is really worth reading. But even just from the humorous perspective of, they're actually going to serve a meal to the Imperials to have whilst Han and Leia are sitting there, makes this story quite enjoyable as well. So I really liked that one. I sort of referenced before, Faith in an Old Friend is a really good story with Lando and the Millennium Falcon, which again, it sort of has callbacks to Solo, so really links in well with that film. So another really great sort of interactive story in that sense. And then we're sort of almost at the end of Empire Strikes Back. So then we have, we've got Right Hand Man, which is from the perspective of 21B, which is the medical droid that fixes Luke with his new robotic hand. And we're getting really interesting exchange between Luke and 21B, where it's almost sort of a philosophical discussion about whether Luke deserves to have this mechanical hand attached. I found it interesting, I guess, because we get some dialogue from 21B on Echo Base, so we do know that he does have a bit of an interaction with Luke in that sense. But it's quite a chatty story. So it's a nice sort of insight into that exchange as well. And then to round off the book, we had Tom Engelberger, who's back for his second installment in riffing off the opening crawl of the movie, I guess you would say, The Wills Strike Back. Really, it's a very, very light-hearted sort of, I wouldn't, if we're talking about these other stories all falling into canon, I wouldn't call this story a canon story. There's a Star Trek reference, for instance, in this story, but it's just a really fun little read, poking fun at perhaps the grammar or the styling of the opening crawl from George Lucas in a really lighthearted, fun way. So just like his story in A New Hope, he just sort of goes through parts of the opening crawl. The Wills, of course, I think in the original A New Hope novelization, it's basically teased as being from the books of the Wills. So the fact that Star Wars is told us a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away is because we're meant to be hearing this story from the perspective of this mysterious species, the Wills. So really enjoyable. So those are probably the stories that really stuck out for me, and there's a lot of them because, of course, between 40 stories, there's going to be a lot that hit. and there were a few that missed, but I don't want to go into too many specifics on stories that missed, because as I sort of said at the start, I enjoyed every story I read. Every story had something in it that I enjoyed. There were 4 different stories from the perspectives of animals in Empire Strikes Back, and before this book came out, I did consider the fact that, unlike A New Hope, where we have the cantina on Tatooine, we have the Tantive 4, we have the Death Star, and we have the Rebel Base, which are all reasonably heavily populated sort of settings for the story, where you do have those options for different perspectives to give you those short stories. I was sort of aware coming into Empire Strikes Back that we have Hoth, we have Bespin, but and I guess we've got the Executor for Darth Vader. But besides those settings, we have Dagobah, which is just Luke and Yoda. We have the asteroid field, which is just Han and Leia. We don't have as many settings in Empire Strikes Back where you have those opportunities for lots of different perspectives. And the settings where we do have lots of characters, it then becomes hard not to fall into a trap of having really similar sorts of short stories. And I liked the animal stories from the perspectives of the Wampas and the Tauntauns. I did like those. I liked the fact that the Wampa story, called Hunger, plays into a few of the deleted scenes from The Empire Strikes Back with the Wampa attacks on the base and things like that. I really enjoyed that. The Tauntaun story, similarly, I enjoyed. There were a few other stories around either side of it where we got the perspectives of the Tauntaun handlers, so I did enjoy how it flowed in with that. By the time we got to, I think it's This Is No Cave, which is from the perspective of the space slug, it did feel like we had a few of these sorts of similar stories where it's that sort of ethereal presence. I guess also we'd had Vergence as well from the perspective of the cave, where it's a really interesting concept and I do really enjoy it. But when you then have a few of them in a row or a few of them close together, it sort of loses the magic of that story a little bit. Similarly, we sort of talked about already the fact that we had a few stories in a row that used the line "Rebellions are built on hope," so that just sort of took me out of those stories a little bit, just because it was kind of repetitious and using that same sort of that quote a few times in a row. And then, sort of as I mentioned, we did have a number of stories that followed a same basic plot of, sort of escaping Bespin or getting away from the Empire on Bespin. And we got Lando's line about, the Imperials have taken control of the city. We advise everyone to leave immediately, in a number of different stories. And I guess this was a little bit different because this was a framing line. It was pinpointing where in the movie we were at reading this story. Rebellions are built on hope was obviously a callback to a line said by Jyn Erso several years before. This still started to feel a little repetitious. We got it in a number of stories, and that sort of detracted a little bit in terms of having the same basic premise for the stories. I think of those sorts of escaping or evading the Empire stories, I did enjoy The Witness a lot. That was from the perspective of a stormtrooper who defected and ended up sort of in the crawl spaces on Bespin and actually witnessed or saw parts of the duel between Vader and Luke. I think if I'm sort of splitting hairs here, and that's as Star Wars fans, that's what we love to do. The idea that Vader didn't sense somebody very, very close as he's walking back from the duel with Luke, this stormtrooper's basically lurking in a crawl space just out of reach, is a little bit unbelievable. I mean, look, maybe Vader's, full of emotion and distracted by his confrontation with Luke. That's completely fine. It wasn't a deal breaker for me. It didn't take me out of the story. And it was clearly sort of a convenient way to give us a perspective of that duel that we haven't necessarily seen. So I didn't mind it. I really enjoyed that story, and the character of that story was a really engaging one as well. So I did like that. But we did get a number of other stories that sort of followed the same broad plot. So it did get a little bit repetitious. But otherwise, I think, as I've said a few times now, all the stories, there were parts of all the stories that I really enjoyed. I haven't spoken about a number of the stories that were really interesting. Like I sort of touched on Tooth and Claw before, from the perspective of Bosk, and it's it's basically got no scene or no moment from the movie in the story. It's almost just an individual story leading up to where we see Bosk in Empire Strikes Back, and it's a really gripping sort of side plot where if we then got a novel exploring the ideas raised in this short story, I would absolutely read it, and I found it a really engaging story. Stet, which was written by Daniel Jose Older, who's also a High Republic author. I wasn't as much of a fan of his book Last Shot, but this story Stet worked really well for me. Really enjoyed the style and structure of it. It was essentially a newspaper article with feedback in the margins from a droid or a person working at this newspaper who was reviewing this story. So the humor really landed for me in this story. I thought the punchlines worked really well. So there were a number of stories that gave us different sorts of perspectives, different sort of styles all through the book from a range of different authors, which were really enjoyable. So sort of summing up my review of this book, just before we head off, is, it's definitely worth a read, really fantastic. And I don't want to give the sense that because I've omitted to mention a particular story, I didn't enjoy it. As I've said, I enjoyed all the stories. It was perhaps, some of them could have had slightly different language used in them or style used in them, because having a few of them bunched up together did start to get a little bit repetitive, if I can get that word out. But reading, I was sort of reading in batches of two, so I'd read two stories at a time and sort of put the book down, and that did mean that it was still fresh when I'd pick it up, and was able to really enjoy the stories. So definitely, if you haven't had a chance yet to pick this up, definitely give it a go. There'll be something in there for you. If you read a particular story and don't find yourself completely enamored with it, keep going. I'm sure you'll get to a story, in a couple of stories time that you absolutely love. So don't sleep on this book too much. I think it's really worth a read. And as I've sort of said, it also gives you a good taste of some of the authors who are coming up in this High Republic media release that Star Wars are doing now. It gives you a good taste of their writing style to see whether you like them or not before you get to their High Republic material. So in that sense as well, it's a really great chance to get to know these authors. And who knows, we might also get other authors who've written in this for the first time in their Star Wars writing career, who then get novels of their own to write down the track. And this will then give you a bit of a taster, so that when they have a novel, you've already read something by them, which makes it even more enjoyable and something to look forward to. So I hope you've enjoyed this book review. I hope it's been really illuminating for you and really useful for you and informative. And we'll try and do a few more of these. I probably won't do it for every Star Wars book that I read, but the ones I'll probably do it. I've got Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule coming in the mail as we speak. So I might do a review of that once I finish that, depending on how quickly I can get that finished, depending on everyone else's sort of reading habits on that one. But until next time, for these book reviews, we'll probably try to do another main episode of the Binge Chickens with my co-host Lo at some stage soon. So keep an eye out for that. And until then, give this episode a like, share it around, comment on it. What did you think of the stories? What were your favorite stories? What didn't work for you as well? Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. The links are in our description as always. And just keep supporting us if you can. It's always appreciated. So thanks, guys. Until next time, see you.